there's no good reason to suppose that his mind or his thoughts are representing any feature of the world which would exist if minds never existed. And to me, okay, that seems like that's not a very good position to take, because doesn't that seem to entail that you can't so Tart, here's a question for Tart. Tart, do you think geometric properties would exist if human minds never existed?
No.
Do you think spatiotemporal properties would exist if human minds never existed?
Probably not in the sense, well, they would exist in the mind of like animals, if that's what you're asking about.
No, but let's suppose no minds ever existed. Do you think spatiotemporal properties would exist?
Not in the way that we conceive of them now. Like the passage.
Would they exist in
no.
any possible? Yeah. So in no way we could conceive of it would spatiotemporal properties exist.
You said it again. You kind of cut off for a second.
Oh, okay. So in no way we conceive of would spatiotemporal properties exist if minds never existed, right?
Yeah, not in the way we conceive of them, no. But that just seems like trivially true. Like if our minds don't exist, then the way that we conceive of something doesn't exist.
Oh, okay, great. So then how could you possibly say spaces? Because we had a discussion the other day. So you seem to take the view that space is fundamental, like space is just it's a part of the universe. But then if you think spatio-temporal relations wouldn't exist if minds never existed, then how could you, or you have no good reason to suppose that spatio-temporal relations would exist if minds never existed? How could you possibly say space would exist? Space would be fundamental.
So you're confusing two different things. So there's the conception of space-time, the way in which you and I sort of like represent something else. But that doesn't. But the step too far. It's the same mistake that Berkeley made. He made the leap to assume that the thing that we are perceiving of, like our perception, is the same as the fundamental thing. And so, as percepi to be perceived, was his conclusion. And so he concluded that if there was no perceivers, that is, no humans or minds at all, then there's no thing that exists in and of itself. And that's where Kant said, no, wait a second, too far, right? So that doesn't follow from any of that. So all that actually follows is that if my conception of it doesn't exist, then the representation that I'm familiar with wouldn't exist. But that's just trivially true. But it doesn't follow from that there's not a thing in itself that the thing is representing. Or at least
the problem is that you can't see anything about the thing which exists, because like all you can see is like X exists, but you can't see anything about it, because like as soon as you started saying something about it, it would just be you'd just be reporting on your concepts, and your concepts don't really represent they don't represent any properties which would exist if your mind never existed. So how could you possibly say anything about the thing which exists besides saying, oh, it's like X, and X possibly causes Y, but you'd have to use these like ambiguous variables like X and Y.
So I never actually said that there's not something about like our representations that are accurate about reality. That was you that kept saying that.
Oh, sorry.
Can you
repeat that?
So I never said that I was like that my position was there's not like something about our like representations that do in fact actually accurately represent reality.
Too bad. But what I have a recording.
Yeah, no, that was what you said. You kept saying that over and over again. I was like, well, no, like you said that there's no good reason. I was like, well, not that there's no good reason. In fact, I specified a type of reason, like an intuitionistic case. But I don't think that there's any sort of inferential or synthetic way to do so, because it's going to beg the question. That was my position. So you gotta focus in on not on like, I think you're looking for a gotcha moment, and it's just not there. You got to focus in on what I'm saying, not on what the argument you're trying to make, because you're trying to take my arguments and my positions and you kind of twist the words a little bit, and then you go and you spit them back out at me and go, oh, there's no good reason. It's like, well, that's not my position. Well, granted, for the the sake of discussion or something like that, because it's close enough that that's not like so like, for instance, space and time. Are you familiar with the theory of the blobject? You know what that is?
Yeah, the blob, yes.
Yeah, the blobject idea. So basically our representation of space-time is going to be something about, that time is actually this real thing and that we're actually passing through it. But that's probably not what's actually happening, right? The blobject theory is just one among many that I'm open to. But basically, the idea is that time is just all points in time are equally real. This is from like physicists also think this. And this is the philosophical ontology. And so, what's actually happening is our experience of time is just us representing that other aspect of space, and that's why space time is one thing. So these are like potential explanations. Now, like I said, I'm not overly committed to anything like metaphysical, so I don't know whether or not the blobject actually exists. And in all honesty, if it did, it's probably one of the more terrifying ideas of ontology from my view. Like I find it persuasive, but also terrifying. It would be nightmarish to know that I was forever locked in the single moments that I experience, and that it would be terrible. I would hate it. But you've got to focus in on like what I'm saying and not so much on what you're saying. But let's say I granted everything here. Imagine for a moment I grant your
Tart, you need to be succinct. I hate to interrupt, but you can't go on for 5 minutes if you want me to respond in a cogent way. So, so the first claim is that I'm misrepresenting you, but we have you on recording, and this is why I want Marco to record everything. We have you on recording saying that there's no good reason to suppose that your minds would represent any properties of the world that would still exist if minds never existed. Now, do you think that's a misrepresentation of your views?
I specified a type of reason that I would be okay with, like an intuitionistic case. I don't know if maybe I think when you watch these videos, you're just kind of trying to pick out the gotcha moment.
It's a yes or no question. So, do you think that's a misrepresentation of your views?
Yes, yeah, it's a misrepresentation. Like it's not.
But I literally have you saying that multiple times
during this debate. You have you on recording saying that multiple times. What I said was that I just said I granted it for the sake of the discussion. I kept going with it. I was
sake of discussion now.
Yeah, I granted.
No, you never said that. You never said that during the previous discussion. You never said, "Oh, I'm just granting."
Do you remember the part about intuitionistic cases that I made? Do you remember that?
Shut up about the meta conversation and actually deal with the argument instead of the meta?
He's just interested in that. He came here for a gotcha.
Right away.
No. He came here for a gotcha. Marco, if you go back and watch the video, I gave a specific one that I would accept because you said there's no good reasons, right? And I kept going with it. And eventually I said, well, no. I mean, that doesn't really follow. My position is closer that you can make an intuitionistic case. Like there might not be any sort of inferential or synthetic reasons, right? So there's types of reasons that I would say no. That's just going to beg the question, right? So if I'm going to use I see things, therefore that's what I'm seeing reality as it is in itself or something like that. That's just going to use the thing that's under question. So those sorts of reasons, no, I don't think those synthetic sort of reasons exist. But what I said was, well, we could make an intuitionistic case. Like you're echoing. So we can make an intuitionistic case, is what I said. So if you could focus on what I'm saying and stop focusing on what you want the argument to be and focus on what I'm actually saying. You have this very motivated way of reasoning, and it's kind of distracting to the discussion. But if you're here for the gotchas, go ahead, gotcha. Try it.
I mean, first of all, so I asked you to be a little bit more succinct, and you're also here for the gotchas, like you're trying to derive a contradiction from my view. So don't be pretentious. Like that's what you're here for. And who's the other person who's interrupting? Because I wanted to mute him because I don't want anybody to interrupt.
No. Yeah, he's
if the person is going to be over talking, I'm just going to leave because I have no interest in talking with two different people, one person interrupting. And then to address your specific claims, your specific views were, until I pressed you on it, that what I summarized previously. But then when I really pressed you on it, you said, you just have this intuition. But then how can I adjudicate between two different people who make different claims based on intuition? Because somebody else might have the intuition that only in their mind exists. So then when you appeal to intuition, that just means you don't have a good you don't have a good argument. There's no way to adjudicate between two claims. So then the discussion is pretty much done because we're just gonna have a disagreement, and you're just gonna appeal to I don't have a good reason. My worldview doesn't give me a good reason to suppose the external world exists. that my mental states represent anything external. That's a theoretical cost of my worldview. But I'm just going to appeal to intuition. I don't care about theoretical costs. I'm just going to appeal to intuition. So that seems to be the argument that you're putting forth to me.
So the first thing you said was that I came here for gotchas. I haven't even brought up the contradiction you made. I literally haven't even mentioned it. So I think you're being motivated about your reasoning, and you're like overly aggressive, and that's why you have a kind of a bad rep on Discord. So chill out. And then also Fleur's mod here. He was just interrupting because it was a meta conversation, was getting boring. He's right. It was. So then the intuitionistic case, no, it doesn't follow.
That's what you're doing. It's all a meta conversation.
It doesn't follow from the intuitionistic case that that you can't adjudicate these things, right? There's nothing about intuition. You do agree that it's false, that you can adjudicate intuitions.
I mean, I would say when you're pressed on an argument and your response is, "Oh, I have an intuition," that is the case, then I can't really adjudicate. I can't really disprove. If your only reason for holding a position is intuition, then I can't really argue against that position.
Okay, that's just false, right? So, like, I can give you specific examples. So, for instance, Daniel Dennett brings up what's called intuition pumps. So, intuition pumps are intended to adjudicate intuitionistic differences. So, second off, there's also this thing called phenomenal conservatism, and phenomenal conservatism says if you can identify a defeater for a position, right? So, something that directly undermines the other position, regardless of its intuitions, it wouldn't be successful, right? So, like, say, for instance, if I look outside my window and I see that the Earth is flat, I might have the intuition, given all of my experiences in life, that the Earth is flat. But I have a defeater for that, right? That we have launched things into space and that we can look at the Earth and it is in fact not flat. So I have a direct defeater for that position. So there are ways to adjudicate counterintuitions. So do you agree now that that is false, that you can in fact adjudicate intuitions? There are methods to do that.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that there are certain intuitions where you can provide like an undercutting defeater. But this is not that type of intuition because you said, because what we're discussing is whether your thoughts represent the external world, and we got to the point where you basically admitted that you don't have any good reasons to suppose they do, except you have an intuition that they do. And I don't see how I could provide any sort of a defeater for that. Except maybe provide like logical arguments, but you would all like, okay, and like I guess I can try providing a logical argument that and I actually did that. I did try to do that last time, but at that point you shifted the argument to you shifted the debate to my views. You never addressed the argument.
I mean, I can address the argument, but the relevance of your views is that you're attacking, and you just mentioned
my views.
Well, you just mentioned just now that you are attacking representationalism, that we're not representing something that's outside of our minds, right? But you said you're a representationalist, so you again are affirming the contradiction. Now, my response to your argument.
What do my views have to do with your views? The fact that my views may be contradictory.
Representationalism while being a professed representationalist. That's just a non-starter.
The fact that my views might be contradictory has nothing to do with the fact that your views are contradictory. And whether my views are contradictory is up in the air because, like, I already outlined what my views are. My views, if you don't like the word representationalism, my views are more accurately captured by intentionalism about mental content, about reference or mental content. So I already told you I'd take a non-standard view of representationalism, which doesn't coincide with the definition that you gave. And the only way you derive the contradiction is by using the definition you gave, which is not my view.
Well, you just a second ago said that you're attacking representationalism, right? Just like literally 5 seconds ago, you said that. Like you said you're attacking representationalism. But
I'm attacking your views on representationalism.
No, you said you were attacking representationalism. Like we
have. Then I misspoke, and I'm attacking specifically your views, and the fact that my views.
I don't know why are we attacking the weird question is the initial conversation when I pinged you, I said let's talk about theism, And we still never got to theism. For some reason, we've been on my views, and I'm like, why are we on my views? They're not even that, like, mine aren't even all that novel. Like, I have a handful of views on different topics, and I've shared them with you. But I've pointed out, look, your argument undermines representationalism. So sure, if you're not a representationalist, cool, then maybe you were just wrong about what representationalism was. That's fine. I didn't attack you about your contradiction. I just pointed it out. I'm glad you're reconciling that view. That shows that you're interested in reconciling it. But don't pretend that you already had reconciled it, because you hadn't. So now the argument itself, premise 3 says that basically no hallucinations represent the external world.
Okay, can I just respond to that prior to you giving the refutation, because you made you made a bunch of claims there.
Sure,
so this is the problem with the whole discussion so far, is that you told me, okay, so the central disagreement is, or the main argument that I presented is that your views. So I talked about like Kuhn's theory selection, and that if you have two models, and one has more theoretical virtues and the other one has more theoretical costs, then you should prefer the one that has more theoretical virtues. And one of the costs of your model, it seems to me, that you have no good reasons to suppose under your model that your visual experiences or your thoughts represent anything which would exist if minds never existed, except, when I really pressed you on it, you said, except intuition. And at that point, I presented an argument, like an undercutting argument of your intuition. And at that point, you shifted from your views to my views. And yeah, okay, so let's just get back to the original discussion. And I would like if you just present your argument against your objections to my argument.
Yeah, so essentially what's going on here, though, is that this is not an analysis of my views, right? This is not like, and you also have what's called a fallacy of a false dichotomy. So there's not a true dichotomy to what you said, right? So there's not just your view or my view, right? And just because you have two views that you might think one has more theoretical virtues. First off, I don't think that your view is going to have more theoretical virtues, but we haven't gotten to your view because you think that every time I criticize it, that I'm shifting something. So it's not an analysis of two views if I'm shifting it to talk about your views, right? So it's just that your methodology is even contradictory here. So like, this is another major issue. Like if you're saying, well, we have one view and it's got more theoretical virtue than the other view, then we should prefer that one. But the problem is that you get mad when I talk about your view and I show that there's a contradiction in
it. We can talk about my views anytime you want.
Well, that was
probably not tonight, because it's already like 10:30 here. But I just want to put this whole discussion into context. I don't think theism has only one theoretical virtue. I think I've demonstrated probably one, but I think theism has explanatory power, in that it can explain the fine tuning of the universe. It can explain objective morality. It can explain how consciousness is fundamental to the universe. It can explain how the universe began. It can explain a whole bunch of stuff that naturalism can't.
So I'll go through and repeat each one of those individually.
Wait, I wasn't done. So okay. That's why I think. So that's why I think theism is preferable over naturalism. So don't try to reduce my views to simply like a very simple mischaracterization, because I'm using multiple lines of evidence for theism.
Well, let's go through each one of those then really quickly. So let's start with
you're gonna give me the objection to the argument.
Let's just refute each one of those, because then if I can refute those, you don't have a reason to believe in God, right? So that was the whole point of the conversation.
Yes, if you could. But wait.
So let's start.
You're gonna give me the objection to the argument first.
Dude. I can talk about whatever the fuck I want to talk about. Stop trying to force me to. I gave you the one I disagree with premise 3. But you said there though is going to be problematic. So first
if
off,
you're going to be insulting
will you stop interrupting for Jesus fucking Christ, Andre?
Okay, I think
can I get out what I'm about to say, for God's sake? So the first one to kind of start with is going to be God be accounting for like objective morality. God would not account for objective morality. God would account for a subjective sense of morality. It would be a special type of subjective morality. But under the views where God could be some kind of an objective morality, like under the three theses of robust realism, which is a view on like the way that you could talk about morality is in terms of three theses: the semantic, the theolethic, and the metaphysical. This one he could actually be under a realist view, but any idealist could be a realist view under that view. So it wouldn't be the case that God could be the only one that under that case, right? So it's going to be the case that like God is going to be the truth maker for a moral proposition, but that's going to be a subjectivist view, because if the truth maker for a moral proposition is an agent, then it's just subjective. So that's the first one. That's going to be the refutation.
I disagree with that.
Yeah, go ahead. How can he account for it then? How can he be a realist account?
Because I actually take your view of what is like. So I draw a distinction between stance dependent and mind dependent. So I think moral facts are stance dependent, but not necessarily mind dependent. By the way, this is a standard view among moral philosophers like Cuneo.
Wait. You said, I think you may have said that backwards just now. You said it's stance dependent, but not mind independent.
Oh, sorry. I meant the stance independent, but not mind independent. Yeah.
Okay, so you think it's stance independent. Does God have a stance?
No, God doesn't have it. Oh, so by stance independent, I mean it's just like irrespective of what we think about it.
Well, no. So stance independence is not just going to be like about just like one agent, right? So like if it's stance independently true that you ought to do something, and God has a stance on that, then and God's stance on that is the thing making it true, then it's not stance independent.
But then wouldn't stance independent just be equivalent to mind independent?
No. So
suppose there's an idealistic world in which only God exists and only human agents exist. Wouldn't stance independent just be equivalent to mind independent?
In which way? Say the world again? What's the nature of this world?
Like suppose there's an idealistic world in which only like God exists and human agents exist.
So what about this world?
Yeah, wouldn't mind independent, wouldn't stance independent just be equivalent to mind independent?
No, so the idea is that stance independent is just about the participation in the truth making. Right? So for instance, if I'm an agent and it's my desires, attitudes, or something toward the proposition making it true, like I like ice cream, for instance, I always use I like ice cream. It's my attitude towards my liking of ice cream that makes the proposition I like ice cream true. So I'm participating in the truth making. Now, if God doesn't participate in the truth making, right? So let's say, for instance, God doesn't take any. It's not about his desires or his attitude or anything like that. If it's none of that, then sure, it can be stance independent of God. But the moment he's participating in the truth making, if he's the thing making it true, then it's not stance independent. It's going to be dependent on God's stance, right? So it's going to be based on God's mind and also stance independent. So something can be, for instance, like I like ice cream. It's going to be mind dependent. There's going to be a dependency on my mind, but let's say, for instance, there's something else that that might be something like mind dependent in the classical sense, but it's not going to be stance dependent. So, for instance, if I'm a solipsist and I'm helplessly making the world around me, and I have no authority over what's happening, it's just sort of happening to me. Right? These things can be stance independent while still being mind dependent, if that were true. So that's kind of the illustration of the difference between stance independent.
Great, but you already admitted that the existence of God is compatible with the existence of objective morality. The problem is
no, under one view it is. Under the classical view, it's not.
Yeah, under whatever view, but naturalism isn't compatible with the existence of objective both in fact, naturalism undermines knowledge of moral facts. So there's both an epistemological problem and an ontological problem under naturalism. The epistemic problem would be that if evolution designed human minds, then it couldn't have been the case that we're discovering just false moral facts. Moral facts, in fact, don't have to correspond to like the species survival. Like it doesn't have to be the case that whatever increases species survival is also like a moral ought or something like that. It could be, in fact, the exact opposite. It could be the case that whatever increases species survival corresponds to like a moral evil. And we can never determine which is the case. If naturalism or evolution is true, we can never determine whether species survival is conducive to discovering or developing cognitive states in which we think moral evils are good. So that's the epistemic argument, and against the possibility of knowing moral facts if naturalism is true. Do you have a counter to that argument?
Yeah, so first I want to start with like the view under which God has the ability to account for a realist view. It's going to be allowing for lots and lots of other views, naturalistic views, non-God views, to also equally account in the same way. So, for instance, it's called the three theses of robust realism. So, the first thesis is the semantic thesis, which is that moral propositions refer to, or they have some sort of alethic function to them, so they're capable of truth or falsity. The second one is going to be the alethic function, so that some moral propositions actually attain, and they are in fact true. And then the final one is the metaphysical one. The thing that making them true is going to be the same thing making everything else true. So any idealist could be an account for a moral realist view, in the same way God could be.
Okay, that's false.
Even like egoist views would qualify under this one. So
okay, I have like major problems with that. I don't know if you want me to talk about it now or after you respond to the argument.
Let's just go ahead and talk about it now, because I think it's more interesting to talk about the fact that I don't think that
so let's consider.
I can finish my statement.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't think that God can actually account for a realist view, not in the way that you usually conceive of it. And under the view that he can, it's going to open the door to all sorts of other views. So that's the whole.
Yeah, so let's talk about those views and see if they're tenable. I mean, you would have to accept that naturalism is compatible with the existence of moral propositions, which would be non-material, right? So then you have non-material objects in the natural universe. So then the question is, how do you define natural? I mean, natural, as far as I can see, can only be defined two ways. Either naturalism boils down to, or is equivalent to physicalism or materialism, which is the idea that only material objects exist. Now, obviously, non-material objects under that view would violate naturalism. So yeah, naturalism is just non-compatible with that. Or suppose you define naturalism as the idea that the best way to discover truth, or the best way to discover what exists and what doesn't, would be the scientific method. But it seems to me that definition is not really compatible with, well, that leads to an epistemic problem, because how could science ever discover non-material moral propositions? It just seems non-material moral propositions would be abstract, causal, and science only discovers causal facts, right? We need observations, we need causality to discover scientific truths. So either so the argument is basically a dichotomy. Either these moral propositions exist abstractly and naturalism is false, or we can't discover any of the moral facts.
Well, it sounds more like you're wanting to define naturalism as like being a not God view, right? A view that doesn't contain a deity as some sort of necessary like component to our epistemology.
It's a vacuous view, then.
Yeah, that's not a vacuous view at all, right? Like that's the contention, is that only the view that contains God can do this, but any view that doesn't contain God would be able to do this as well, right? So, like for instance, metaphysical naturalism, you might say, well, that's going to be a problem, but then epistemic naturalism, you might be okay with, right? Like presumably you've defended epistemic naturalism.
No, I don't think I never defended epistemic naturalism. In fact,
oh, absolutely, yes, you did.
I think there's a conflict, and like I outlined, I think there's a conflict between epistemic naturalism and discovering moral facts, because moral facts are supposed to be abstract, causal. How could the scientific method ever discover causal abstract facts?
Are you a scientific realist or no?
Yes, I'm a scientific realist.
Epistemic naturalism. Do you not know what like epistemic naturalism is? Like it's methodological naturalism. It's just talking about a way of knowing things. It doesn't mean you have to know everything that way, right? That's not the view. So like epistemic naturalism is just, it's methodological naturalism. It's the way in which it's one of the ways that we discover things. Now, you can hold to all sorts of different views. So for instance, non-naturalism is going to be symmetrical with like a naturalist view, in the sense that, like, so for instance, it's not going to require a god. Like non-naturalist, a non-naturalist view on morality, it doesn't require a god or anything, right? So what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to say, oh, well, if naturalism is true, then then ethical naturalism has to be true, and it can be the only account. It's like, well, no, not really, right? So the type of naturalism that you're saying, or that can't do it, is the type that just doesn't contain God, right? So, but presumably, you think God is a natural function and feature of the universe, or you think he's like this thing that's completely divorced from the universe, and he just created the universe, all that is natural, right? But if he's divorced from it, you're going to run into the same epistemic problem that you think that people have when it comes to discovering moral facts, right? We can't know anything about God if he's entirely separate from the universe.
Why is that?
But the same reason you just outlined, right? Like you just outlined. Like you're going to need those causal.
I don't see the argument. I don't see the reason for that.
So you're going to, in order for you to know him scientifically, wouldn't you need that? You need that causal interaction. That was your claim.
Not necessarily. I mean, but first of all, God is not an causal object, right? God is not an abstract object. So God is able to interact with the physical laws of the universe. So the argument, the objection, doesn't seem to merit. It has no merit. And
well,
then second,
how does God interact with?
I wasn't done.
Go ahead.
So that's the first problem, is that God is not an abstract object, and the second problem is that, well, I just lost my train of thought.
Well, I was just going to ask, how does God interact with like moral truths or whatever? Like, right, if he has causal abilities and they don't, like, how is he interacting with them?
Well, I don't think moral truths exist separately from God.
Perfect. So you're a subjectivist.
No, I mean, I already told you how I define subjectivist. Okay, if you want to call me like, no, I don't think I'm a subjectivist, because the way I define subjectivity is that subjectivity is when, like, some proposition depends on the minds of human agents. But if it depends on the minds of a necessary agent, then I don't think that's, yeah. My definition is, it just excludes that from being subjective.
So if an alien society, for instance, built a big building and they said, "Oh, that's a big building," because it's not human agents making it true, it's going to be
not a necessary entity, right?
Well, you didn't say necessary entity. All you said was about humans, right?
He did say necessary entity.
I'm sorry, what was that?
He did say necessary entity. That was the exact words he used.
I didn't hear necessary entity. Yeah, I just don't. Even if it is a necessary being, like, if you're a necessitarian, like, right, I would be a necessary being under a necessitarian view, right? Would that make my sort of views somehow no longer like subjective? Would they become objective at that point?
Well, I just reject your views. Sorry, I just reject necessity. Yeah, I don't think you're a necessary agent.
Well, yeah, I'm asking a question about the definition. Would you hold that if I was necessary, like if it was the case that I existed in all possible worlds, would that change all of my attitudes toward things like, for instance, I like ice cream? Would it suddenly no longer become subjective? It would be objective. If the answer is no to that question, then it just doesn't follow that this somehow makes God's perspective somehow unique.
I just think that's a false counterfactual. It's a state of affairs that could never obtain. So whatever hypothetical you're gonna argue, like you're gonna raise from a false counterfactual, it's just not relevant.
It is. It's a direct counter to your definition, right? So, like, if you're saying something like God is like, because God is necessary, his sort of subjective facts are somehow objective, right? Because he's necessary. It's like, well, wait a second. What if I was necessary? Like, if I existed in all possible worlds, and like,
yeah, that's equivalent to asking, if you were like a snake, would you not have any legs? Like, that question doesn't have a good answer, because it's not possible for you to be a snake, right? Because identity is necessary. So then, like, who cares if you were a snake? Would you have any legs? It's just it's a nonsensical question.
It's not nonsensical, and more importantly, it's a direct objection to the way that you're trying to categorize these things, right? So, like, if a necessitarian is standing here, they go, "Oh, well, then every view, everything is objective at that point." Surely we'd say, "Well, no, I like ice cream, even even if you're a necessitarian, you hold that every being is necessary, right? I'm necessary, you're necessary, Marco's necessary. It just doesn't follow from that. There's nothing about that us being necessary that suddenly makes our subjective facts, the things that I'm participating in the truth making, they've just suddenly become objective because of that. There's nothing about that that makes them objective. They're still just as subjective. And so that's a direct counter to your positions, because you're wanting to say, well, humans are different because they're not necessary. But it's like, well, what if they were? Would it make it the case? And you're still wanting to say, well, no, even if they were necessary, it wouldn't be the case. And I'm going like, well, but wait a second. Then why is it?
Isn't objective morality which is just the idea that there are certain moral propositions? So the definition you gave is that morals are objective if there are certain moral propositions which would obtain irrespective of our stance on it, right? And then
depends on your view of objectivity. Like what I said was the class there's basically like you can think of it like two different.
But I wasn't done. So that's like the standard
view.
view.
Good question.
Yeah, so that's like the standard view. So then I just don't see how that's incompatible with the existence of God. I mean, presumably you think that moral propositions can exist if God exists, whether they're part of like God's mind or whether they exist independently. Do you agree?
Well, depends on the view. So what I said was, under the classical view, God cannot be a realist, right? It has to be mind dependent under the classical view. So what I said was, God cannot be a realist under the classical view. So objectivity is not possible under God in the classical sense. Now, there's a modernistic sense, the way that's kind of talked about in the more recent literature, the three theses I mentioned, that would allow for God to be a realist. But the problem is that any idealist would count as a realist under that view, any one of them. And so it can't be the case that your original claim, which was that God is the only one that can account for a moral realist stance, could be true under that one. So you're sort of stuck in this dichotomy. Either on the first horn, if you take the classical sense, God can't be a realist at all. He's an anti-realist. Under the second horn, though, you have many different accounts that would be realist in the same sense that God would be a realist view. And so it can't be the case that God's the only account. So in both cases, God can't be the only account. Right.
Okay, so like you're talking about like an ontological objection, or like you're talking about ontology. You're saying that okay, so yeah, it's possible that God and like objective moral propositions coexist in the same universe or in the same reality, but like any idealist could take that view, right?
Depends on which one. So under the first view, the answer is no. It's just going to be mind dependent, right? So if you mean by objective, you mean mind independent, then no. Now, if you say something like stance independent, that's also not going to work for God, because unfortunately God is the truth maker for all of them. So stance independence is about the agent not participating in the truth making, right? That's the definition.
But wait, do you think God's attitude is the truth maker, or do you think God's nature is the truth maker? Because those are two different things. So I take stance independence to be that the moral propositions are they don't depend on your attitudes. So then under this view, moral propositions wouldn't depend on God's attitude; they would just depend on God's nature. So the moral propositions would be stance independent, wouldn't they?
Well, I don't think that your attitudes are like outside your nature, are they? Like presumably, like I like ice cream. I desire ice cream. It's in my nature to like and desire ice cream, because if I'm an evolved being, for instance, we like sugar for reasons that are evolutionarily sort of founded, right? Like that doesn't solve the issue, because being outside your nature is like, well, what does it mean that it's in his nature? Do you mean that it's some kind of limitation about him? Like, for instance, it's in my nature that I can't jump to the moon. That it's a limitation of me. But then you have a limit of God.
Do you think there are certain attitudes within your like? Yes, I understand that certain attitudes might not be within your control, but or like certain attitudes are entailed by your nature. But I don't think all attitudes are entailed by your nature. You would need a separate argument for that. And do you have one?
So I didn't make that claim. I just don't think that they're like completely separate. Like what would it mean for an attitude to be like completely separate from your nature?
It just means that the attitude is separate from your nature. I mean, you said like the only way your argument works is that if all attitudes are equivalent or identical to your nature. I mean, you presumably have a reason or like an argument for that, and I'd like to hear one.
That's not quite what I said. So what I said is I don't think there's a way to divorce your attitudes from your nature. So for instance, if what I'm not saying is like all things like when I'm born or something like that, I don't think all my attitudes are like determined by the genetics of the components of me. And presumably you don't think God has. I don't know if you're divine, like you hold divine simplicity, but presumably you don't think God even has parts. So there's not going to be something componential about him in that sense. So that
presumably, but I'm undecided. Like you're just presuming that I hold to divine simplicity, but I don't have firm views on that.
Okay, so you think God might have? I mean that's fine.
I have no idea.
So the idea is what I'm saying is I think you might be confusing nature in the sense of like components like my DNA or something like that with nature in the sense of like some sort of like a metaphysical nature, like the way in which I am, like just whatever I am. So I don't think that your attitudes can be like divorced from you in that sense, right? Like it's going to be something.
I mean, presumably you think that like even like with human nature, we have like certain control over like or just like predetermined like you have certain predetermined attitudes to like ice cream or not like ice cream, but presumably you think you have certain control over that.
Yeah, those are going to be like about reasons, right? So like the ones that are going to be outside of just of something like that are going to be something about like reasons. So there's going to be something separate from me, some set of facts that account for those. Now those facts are still going to like interact with me in some way, right? So like for instance, my attitude about my beliefs in certain philosophical realms are motivated by reasons that are external to me. So like for instance, my readings of different writers. Now, God can't really have that sort of external motivation. He can't. There's nothing about the world until God creates it. So when you say it's you say it's about God's nature, right? That's what you're saying is going to make these moral propositions true.
Okay, but now what you're saying, it seems to me now what you're saying is that moral propositions are logically dependent on God's nature and his reasons for acting in certain ways, as opposed to his arbitrary attitudes.
So well, you can't have reasons though, right? That was the whole point. Like he can't have reasons until there's something external to him. But if it's like there's not going to be some set of reasons.
That's a completely separate argument, though. And I feel like we're going down like a rabbit trail where you just keep using new arguments. So God can't have any reasons without like something external. I mean, you're gonna have to justify that, but I feel like we're going away from the original topic.
So well, no, we're still on the same topic. It's whether or not God is the truth maker.
Okay. Let me show you how we're diverging from the original topic, because your original claim was that God can account for morality, and God is compatible with morality, but any idealist world can also account for it, right?
That was one of the horns. We're on the other horn. Yeah, that's one of the horns. We're on the other horn right now.
Okay, no, that was the original horn that I was dealing with, and like that doesn't entail, like I don't think that's a good objection, because that doesn't entail that the probability of those two hypotheses are equal. It doesn't mean like maybe it's the case that like very implausible idealistic worlds account for the same very very improbable naturalistic idealistic worlds account for the same data as the theistic hypothesis. And specifically what I mean by that is that it's probably the case that you can know moral facts under that naturalistic idealistic world. And I gave you the argument. You never responded to the argument. I gave you the argument that you couldn't know moral facts because they're acausal. So how do you think you could know? I actually gave you two separate arguments that you never responded to: the evolutionary argument and the acausal, like the argument from abstract objects. So are you going to respond to those arguments?
Yeah, I don't believe in abstract objects. I just think that's nonsense.
So what do you think moral propositions would be under naturalism?
There's lots of different views, but I mean, do you want to talk about it under naturalism, or do you want to talk about it?
What is your view? What do you think is the most plausible?
So the view that I think is the most plausible is that like natural facts fix moral facts, but they're not like it's not something about like a grounding relationship for normative facts. I think normativity is going to be fixed by natural facts, though. Like so a non-naturalist account makes more sense to me.
Do you think it could have been the case that evolution could have, like, let's say, do you think it could have been the case we could have evolved in a parallel universe in which we, like, human consciousness, let's just say, evolved in a body of like termites or something, and termites eat their young, right? And like, do you think it could have been the case that humans evolved in such a way that they would have found it like a correct moral action to eat their young?
Do I think that there could be instances? Yeah. I'm a particularist. I think that there are actually potential ways in which things that we might find morally bad in our world, given the facts that exist. If those facts are different, then yeah, there's all sorts of other things that can happen. But you're going to have some sort of relationship between the natural facts, right, and the moral facts. So, like for instance, if let's say there's you can come up with all sorts of reductios for like a generalist account where like it's always wrong to do X, right? Now, there's plenty of generals that try to say something like it's always wrong to do X just for fun. That is, they try to eliminate all the other potential reasons. But the question that you're asking here is, kind of a little bit peculiar because you're saying human consciousness evolving in termites, and I'm going like that would just be termite consciousness.
Yeah, in the body of termites.
That would just be termite consciousness. I don't see how that would be human at all. Like, how is it human if it's a termite?
Yeah, good point. Good point. Maybe it's not a good thought experiment, but
I don't know.
You have to give me an account of how natural facts could possibly fix moral facts, because it seems to me like natural facts are a type of the type of fact in which you say, well, there's this particle. It's like descriptive facts, right? When science discovers something, it just describes the phenomenon and it tells you that, oh, there's these objects which move in a certain way, which pull and push, and there's certain force exerted, certain energy transfers. Can you tell me how, like, where you find odds among the basic forces of nature, like energy transfer, pushing and pulling, for fundamental forces? Is there any odds to be found there?
Maybe you don't know what not. Do you not know what non-naturalism is?
So I don't see how that's addressing the argument, but like, do I know what non-naturalism is?
Yeah. Do you know what non-naturalism with respect to metaethics?
Yeah, it's just a rejection of naturalism.
No. So non-naturalism is the view that you don't find them in this scientific way. So the way that we would go out and find them scientifically is just not what we're doing. So they're known a priori. That's the non-naturalist stance. So you're asking where would we find them in charge and particles is just like you're presuming a naturalistic stance on metaethics, and I'm wondering if maybe you just don't know metaethics well enough to talk about that.
The reason why I'm presupposing that is because I already told you that there are like two ways to define naturalism. One would be that science is the way to discover facts about the universe, about reality. And I guess the other way to define naturalism would be the only thing which exists, physical objects. So
no, that's exhaustive. So the first one's going to be, so you have like methodological naturalism, which is an epistemic view, right? So like for instance, Kant was a methodological naturalist, but he was not a metaphysical naturalist, right? Now you might define metaphysical naturalism in terms of objects and physicalism, but in the instance that we're talking about, you're making the claim that naturalism can't account for these things, therefore God. So for that to be a true dichotomy, you have to hold that naturalism isn't the sort of naturalism we counter in in philosophy in that way. It's going to have to be the view that there's not a God, right? So naturalism is going to be the not God view of some kind in order for that to be dichotomous. That way, if you falsify all instances where there's not a God, then it leads to there being a God. But if you don't define it that way, then your argument just kind of ends up being moot.
I think that's just a very murky view then, because it ends in a rejection of the existence of God. And like, what does that tell you about the nature of reality? It doesn't really tell you anything. So that's why I'm saying,
Andrew, you're making the same type of false dichotomy as when a creationist makes the comment that evolution doesn't tell us anything about the origin of the universe. It's the exact same type of false dichotomy.
Who's
You're
this
trying
person?
to get something to apply in a way it has no reason to apply in that way.
Hey, sorry, who are you?
Just a random guy from another server.
Okay, why are you interrupting?
It doesn't matter. You address the point.
because I'm just gonna leave. If there are like
Okay.
two different people, if there's one person interrupting,
I mean, that's your prerogative. That's like 100% fine with you. Like that is like we're not controlling you.
yeah, okay, fine. I just want to make like one concluding remark. So basically, I just find it highly implausible that if you define naturalism according to these standard accounts, and the other account is extremely murky because then it doesn't tell you any positive attributes about what reality is supposed to be. I find that like just highly like implausible because it's not even like all it's saying is that there's X. There's no God, but the X exists, and like what is that supposed to mean? So then, if you just define naturalism according to standard views, I find it highly implausible that there could be moral oughts among just physical objects. So, like among just elementary particles, there's supposed to be like the like oughts. Just you'd have to give a very good account of that.
Yeah, that's the naturalist stance on metaethics, which is different than the naturalist stance on ontology, and which is different than the naturalistic stance on epistemology. You're confusing and conflating all of them, and then setting up these false dichotomies where if you knock down naturalism, you think you've proven theism, and you don't. Not unless you set up naturalism as being an actual dichotomy to your God, which is just that there's not a God, so whatever exists is not going to be something supernatural. That's going to be the type of naturalism that you need to falsify in order to prove your God, right? Otherwise, it's just.
I don't really see you responding to the idea that like it's like highly implausible that there should be oughts among like elementary particles or something like that.
I am a
So yes, I'm making a metaphysical.
Okay.
So yes, I'm making a metaphysical claim, but I just don't see like a response to that.
I'm a non-naturalist. That is a response if you know what non-naturalism is, but I don't think you do, and that's why you don't understand that as a response.
Yeah, I don't know what non-naturalism is. So you said it's like a priori knowledge of like.
So moral facts are going to be something a priori. They're not going to be something that we go out and we find like under a rock. I can't dig up in the same way that we have like epistemic norms are going to be a priori. All sorts of norms. In fact, normativity is going to be a priori. It's not going to be something that we find out there in the world. So like maybe some types of.
But don't you think this a priori knowledge corresponds to something which exists?
I mean, yeah, the moral facts exist, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be. That doesn't. You're presuming that like something existing means that it has to be like synthetic of some kind, and that's just I don't know why you presume that. I think that that you have to go out in the world. I have to dig it up under a rock to find it.
Well, no, just existing. I mean, just like being out there in the world. Like, for instance, I mean, naturalism assumes that like particles exist. So then, like moral facts would have to exist in some way, for them to be truth makers. So then where do you think moral facts exist? Like, do you think like they exist among elementary particles? Do you think they exist in the forces of nature, laws of nature? Do you think?
So you're presuming like the only kind. You're presuming that under like a naturalistic view of some kind, like that there has to be like a spatial location for them, and I just don't think that has to be the case, right? Like in the same way, for instance, that epistemic norms. So like I have an epistemic norm about something is not going to have that, right? An alethic norm is not going to have that either. Like all these different norms, I think that they don't need that. Where are they? Like where I can't point to you to like a rational, right? I can't point to you to a justification. I can point you to evidence, and that evidence can be justificatory. That is, that it raises the probability of something else. But I can't point you to that probability going up or to that evidence being reason giving to believe something else. None of those normative facts can I point to like that. Now that doesn't.
You don't think there's such things as properties? Like so for instance, let's say there's like moral properties which exist in this Like
It
the
said
view
more
you
properties.
hold, presumably you think there are such things as moral properties that are truth makers, right?
Yeah, I think there are more properties. Yeah.
So where do you think these moral properties, you think these moral properties exist?
Keep asking where. That's not a thing. Like there's not a where.
Spatial location.
There's not a where. That doesn't happen.
So they don't have a spatial extension. They don't have a spatial location. Do they have any causal powers?
So I'm up in the air on that one. I think probably the answer is no. Otherwise, we would all just act perfectly moral. We would all just act perfectly moral. But we don't.
Okay. So they don't have causal powers. They don't have spatial extensions. They don't have spatial location. How's that not an abstract object?
So, for instance, an abstract object is going to be like something like in the Platonist view, it's going to be something like a being like outside of space and time. I think it's like going to be like outside of space and time. That's still going to be a location.
No, that's not true.
Oh, you think that Platonic objects don't exist outside of space and time?
No, they just don't have a spatial extension, and they don't have causal powers.
Yeah, I don't think they. I didn't say that they had because that they didn't have causal powers. They don't. Of course not.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah, and I said okay, like the Platonic view is that yes, Platonic objects don't have a spatial extension. They don't have to exist. Like, what does it for an object which doesn't have a spatial extension? What does it even mean to exist within space and time?
I think first off that existence is going to be some kind of like a primitive. There's not going to be some sort of a definition for existence or anything like that, right? And so I don't.
I think there's a definition. Whatever possesses properties exists.
Do unicorns possess properties?
That's I'm not exactly sure which view to take on that.
Yeah. So I mean, like, I just think that's a bad definition. So but I think there's a reductio for every definition of existence. I think existence is just like some kind of a quantifier, but I don't think it's I don't think it's something that we can really define that way. And there's lots of terms like that I don't think we can really define. Like goodness is going to be like a really like we can give like some kind of a direction about it. Like goodness is whatever we ought do, but then whatever we ought do is just going to be whatever we have certain moralistic reasons to do. It's just going to keep going back, and none of it's ever going to get to like a non-normative sort of sense of the way that we talk about goodness. So goodness.
Okay. So basically, what you told me so far is that these you think physical facts fix moral propositions, and these moral propositions are non-spatial. They don't have a spatial location. They don't have a spatial extension, and they're non-causal. And I'm trying to understand how that's different from a Platonic object. And you've given me no differences, like no distinction between the two so far. So I'm just gonna assume, and I'm at this point I'm just gonna have to leave. But I just want to summarize the whole discussion that we had so far, Tart. I began with a question, like I just asked you a bunch of questions about your views, and we seem to arrive at a point where I gave you an argument against your views, and I asked you to defend it, and you didn't, and you said, "Oh, I'm gonna like just start talking about my view, like your views from now on," right? So I'm just wondering, I'm lost for words. Why you didn't stop defending your views?
What was the argument?
This is the argument from hallucination, and you said, "Oh, I want to talk about God from now on." And
well, I started to attack that, and you kept interrupting me, and then so I said I gave a response to something you said, and then I said, okay, now I'll talk about that, and then you wanted to respond to my response, and so we ended up going down a different trail only because you kept responding. Like if you just let me finish the statement, I had a whole thing that I started to lay out, but you kept interrupting, and that's why we ended up down this route. I think just that was.
See that this is the value of having a recording, because I asked you, I think twice, to talk about the argument from hallucinations, and
but you kept responding to my other argument.
Wait, you're interrupting again.
You wanted to cut me off.
Start.
Look, if you're gonna misrepresent me, I'm gonna interrupt you, man. So, like, first off, you wanted.
At this point, I'm just gonna have to leave.
Dude. Okay, well, cool. Look, if he wants to sit there and say something like, "Oh, I asked you to respond to this," I started to respond to it 3 times in this recording. I started several times to respond to what he said. My objection was to premise 3. If you can go back and listen to the recording, that's the premise I reject. I was objecting to. But what I did was I responded to what he said, and then I tried to respond to the argument, but he kept interrupting me because he wanted to respond to the other thing that I said. And that's why we ended up down this rabbit trail and never got to the conversation about premise 3. That was the whole reason. So it was entirely his fault. I didn't keep trying to go down this rabbit trail until he was trying. All he wanted to do was he wanted to cut me off. He was trying to be like, no, I don't want you to respond to what I just said. I want you to go over here and respond to this. And it's like, okay, no. I'm going to respond to what you just said. And then if you want to move to another topic, sure, we can move back to that other topic. But you went down this rabbit trail. And then he kept interrupting me when I was trying to say it. So I'm going to interrupt him here at the end. Fuck him.